They said winter would come softly this year, drifting in like a familiar guest. But as December 2025 approached, something else arrived, something colder than temperature, older than seasons. A hush that did not belong to weather settled over the northern hemisphere, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Winds that once came from the west now wandered in confused spirals. The compasses and distant outposts spun half a degree off. Their old bearings and even the dawn seemed reluctant to rise, pausing on the horizon like a hesitant messenger, unsure whether to deliver its news. It began subtly, a week where daybreak arrived minutes later than prediction. Storms that twisted in shapes meteorologists had no names for. Nights so unnaturally quiet that dogs refused to bark and flocks of migrating birds veered off course, circling deserts as though they were magnetic traps. At first, these were footnotes, curiosities for weather blogs and small research stations. But soon, beneath the veneer of normality, people everywhere felt the same thing. Winter was not behaving like winter. It was behaving like a sign. There are winters of climate and winters of the spirit. And then there are winters that arrive as warnings, silent, deliberate, almost ceremonial. This was one of them. It was in this atmosphere of uneasy quiet that Edgar Cayce's name returned not as a historical curiosity, but as a presence. The old readings, once relegated to dusty shelves and late-night radio, began circulating again, whispered in online forums, cited in academic conferences, with a strange mix of embarrassment and intrigue. For decades, his visions had hovered in that gray zone between mystic poetry and improbable foresight. But now, they read like the preface to a story the world was finally entering. Cayce had spoken of a final winter, a season unlike any before it, when the earth would send signs not as destruction but as awakening wind patterns, turning strange, lights in the sky shifting, the crust murmuring beneath distant oceans. He described a planet beginning to tilt toward a new cycle, not abruptly, but gradually, like a wheel gathering momentum before a great turning. And he warned that humanity would recognize this winter not by snow or cold, but by the feeling that the familiar rhythms of Earth had slipped slightly out of tune. That was the feeling people could not name. The sense that something invisible had leaned against the world. Reports began arriving from the Arctic monitoring stations, instruments detecting magnetic wavering beyond expected thresholds. At the same time, fishermen along the Norwegian coast described auroras so low and so crimson they seemed like curtains of burning fog. In the Midwest, a sudden warm current swept across farmland, melting frost overnight and releasing the scent of soil in the dead of winter. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, in Japan, January winds carried the strange metallic taste that villagers had once associated with distant volcanic rumblings. None of these events alone meant anything, but together, they echoed a pattern one Cayce had outlined with uncanny clarity. He spoke of times when Earth would speak through tremors and tides, when nature's anomalies would be like quiet knocks at humanity's door, asking whether anyone still remembered how to listen. And listening was exactly what people began to do, though not consciously. They noticed the silence first. The way nights grew stiller as December deepened, the way the air felt charged, like the few seconds before a lightning strike, the way animals paused mid-movement, as if sensing a tug from beneath the ground. Every winter before had been a season of cold. This one was a season of caution. Cayce had once said, "The earth will give signs not to frighten, but to awaken." And this winter, this strange, misplaced winter felt like one such sign. Not a prediction of doom, but a whisper along the spine, urging humanity to look not outward, but downward and inward at the same time. Downward, toward the planet's shifting pulse. Inward, toward the part of the human soul that instinctively recognizes when change is near. There is another detail in Cayce's readings that resurfaced. He described the coming changes as the earth realigning her foundations. He said seasons would behave like questions, not answers, that the wind would carry messages from the outer spheres. These phrases had once sounded poetic, metaphorical, but now, as meteorological anomalies multiplied, they gained a new weight. The world seemed to be asking questions indeed. Why are the polar winds reversing? Why are auroras appearing where they should not? Why do the compasses hesitate before choosing a direction? In the southern hemisphere, sailors crossing the Pacific noted a vibration beneath the hulls of their ships, rhythmic, almost like the heartbeat of something vast and deep. Geologists later confirmed unusual seismic hums traveling across the ocean floor. Not quite earthquakes, not quite tectonic drift, but something in between. When these findings surfaced online, many recalled Cayce's reference to the Earth's inner parts quickening. A quickening is not violence, it is movement before birth. And that is how this winter felt. Not like an ending, but like a beginning wrapped in cold. Around the world, there was a rise in dreams, vivid ones, dreams of oceans rising or splitting, of skies flickering with strange light, of standing on the edge of continents while the ground hummed beneath bare feet. Psychologists labeled them stress responses. But others felt something different, a memory within the human spirit, old as myth, stirring again. Cayce had claimed that the soul remembers previous world ages, previous shifts, previous winters of correction, and this winter, for reasons no one could fully explain, felt ancient, As the days shortened further, something else happened. People reported a sense of waiting, of holding their breath without realizing it. Some said they felt like they were standing in the doorway of a new chapter, unable to see the words but sensing their presence. Others described it as a pause, as though the world was gathering itself before an unseen threshold. And in that pause, that global inhalation, one idea crystallized. Maybe this winter wasn't a season at all. Maybe it was a signal, a prelude to what Cayce called the turning, the moment when the old balance of Earth and humanity gives way to the new. Winter should have been familiar, but this one wasn't. It was a mirror, a warning, and an invitation all at once. A winter that should not exist unless the world was preparing for something long foretold. It is one thing for a prophet to speak of a world tilting toward change. It is another thing entirely when the planet itself begins to act as if it has overheard the prophecy. As the strange winter of 2025 deepened, scientists quietly released a new set of measurements figures that would have passed unnoticed in any ordinary year. But this was not an ordinary year, and these numbers, though clinical on paper, carried an echo that felt unnervingly familiar. The magnetic North Pole, long a slow wanderer, had accelerated again, slipping across the top of the world toward Siberia at nearly 40 kilometers a year. To most people, such a movement sounded abstract, irrelevant to daily life. But to those who studied the magnetosphere, it was a sign that the very invisible shell protecting the planet was loosening, trembling, adjusting itself like a cloak caught in a sudden wind. And to anyone who had ever read Edgar Cayce, this magnetic drift felt eerily like the opening chord of the melody he described. Cayce had spoken of a time when the poles would shift, though he never meant an overnight catastrophe. His words painted a gradual, accelerating imbalance and invisible wobble that would begin quietly before rippling into every layer of life, whether oceans, consciousness. He said the Earth would not break from a single blow. It would lean first, as though weighing its options. And now, more than 80 years later, that lean had begun. If the magnetosphere were a great harp stretched around the planet, then 2025 was the year its strings began to vibrate. Strange auroras flickered across skies where they did not belong, glowing over Texas, shimmering above France, tinting the beaches of Brazil with faint curtains of violet. Social media reacted first, stunned by skies that looked like spilled ink soaking into the atmosphere. Yet beneath the fascination lingered a deeper unease. The Earth was glowing in colors meant for far colder latitudes. Scientists explained what they could: solar, wind, magnetic disturbance, increased particle penetration from the sun, but the explanations were delivered with a tone of caution, as though the experts themselves were only partially convinced. When asked whether these auroras suggested a weakening magnetic field, they chose their words carefully. The magnetosphere is dynamic, they said. It shifts naturally, but even they could not deny the timing. The solar cycle was inching toward its maximum peak, one of the strongest in decades. If a coronal mass ejection struck while the field was in this weakened, unstable state, the result could be profound. Cayce warned of such convergence, Earth changes that would happen not in isolation but in chorus, each phenomenon amplifying the next. And for the first time, prophecy and scientific data appeared to be studying the same horizon, one from the language of readings, the other from the language of magnetometers. Meanwhile, deep beneath the oceans, another transformation stirred. Autonomous seafloor sensors began to record rising temperatures not from above, as climate models predicted, but from below. Heat rose through volcanic fissures once thought dormant. Hydrothermal plumes doubled in intensity along the Pacific ridges. And within the vast trenches near Tonga and the Kermadec Arc, something extraordinary was happening. New magma domes swelling upward like slow, fiery breath. These were not headlines for most of the world, but they were unmistakable echoes of Cayce's words. There shall come a quickening in the inner parts of the earth. Those who have eyes will know a great change is at hand. He had spoken of lands rising where there was only sea, of old formations breaking apart as the planet prepared for a new balance. Scientists called it tectonic uplift. Cayce called it rebirth. The names differed. The meaning did not. Then came the volcanoes. Not the dramatic explosions that make breaking news, but a subtler awakening, one that trembled across continents like a growing memory. The Aleutian chain murmured with long, low-frequency quakes. Italy's Campi Flegrei swelled a fraction of an inch every few weeks, lifting entire towns by the thickness of a fingernail. In Indonesia, steam plumes rose from mountains that had not exhaled in centuries. And in America, deep under Yellowstone, instruments recorded pulses of magma, intrusion minor, but rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a sleeper turning in bed. To Cayce, these were not signs of wrath. They were adjustments, Earth stretching after a long rigidity, realigning her internal architecture. He said the disturbances would begin slowly, as a warning, not a terror, and that people would mistake them for isolated incidents. But the wise, he said, would recognize the pattern: pressure rising in the Pacific, energy migrating inward, the crust preparing for what he described as the breaking of the new age. Weather joined the chorus next. Storms swirled in irregular shapes, bending into arcs that resembled spirals seen only in simulations. Jet streams dipped and rose with strange insistence. Across Europe, Warm winds from the Sahara surged deep into the continent, unsettling birds and disrupting sea currents. And in Antarctic along, the world's frozen sentinel temperatures spiked beyond recorded precedent, shattering expectations like glass. Again, Cayce's words surfaced: the warm shall become cold, the cold shall become warm. A line so simple, so poetic, yet so unnervingly literal now. Climate specialists hesitated to label the anomalies. Some pointed to cyclical oscillations. Others whispered, off-record, that the planet's distribution of heat was acting as though tilted not by angle, but by energy flow. Tilt is an interesting word. Prophets use it to describe destiny. Scientists use it to describe alignment. In 2025, both meanings intersected. People felt it intuitively. Reports of unease, sleeplessness, recurring dreams of rising water or shifting landscapes became oddly common across cultures that shared no language. A fisherman in Iceland dreamed of watching the auroras fall like rain. A woman in Chile dreamed of continents drifting like paper boats. In Alaska, hunters spoke of hearing the ground hum beneath the frost. These were dismissed as anecdotes until they became too numerous to ignore. Cayce had said that human consciousness and planetary energy were woven together, that when one shudders, the other trembles. It was a poetic idea once. Now it felt like an observable phenomenon. By late 2025, the planet no longer behaved as a stable background to human life. It behaved like a character in its own unfolding narrative, one ancient, awake, and preparing for something. The magnetosphere trembled. The oceans warmed from the underworld, the skies shifted color, and hearts, across the world, felt an unnamable pull. Prophecy was no longer a story told by the past. It was an interpretation of the present. And science, once the skeptic in the room, found itself standing beside Cayce, staring at the same signs from different angles. The Earth was speaking, and both prophets and physicists were finally beginning to listen. There are warnings spoken in thunder, and there are warnings spoken in silence. For centuries, mystics across cultures described a moment when the world would go quiet, too quiet, when the familiar hum of civilization would fade and humanity would stand face to face with something older than fear. They called it many names: the great stillness, the long night, the 3 days of darkness. Edgar Cayce never spoke the phrase directly, yet his descriptions circled it like a shadow around a flame. He spoke of a time when the light of the sun will be dimmed, when the earth would pause, and when humanity would be forced to remember that light was never ours to command. For a long time, these words lived in the realm of myth, but as 2025 unfolded, the myths found a bridge quietly, unexpectedly through science. It began with a simple truth. The magnetosphere was weakening, not collapsing, not failing, but thinning in places like an old shield worn down by centuries of cosmic wind. Under normal conditions, this invisible shell repels most of the sun's outbursts. But 2025 was not normal. The solar cycle was reaching its maximum, and sunspots dark. Boiling scars on the star's surface had multiplied faster than predicted. Telescopes around the world observed flares arcing outward, twisting like molten ropes, releasing energy capable of scrambling satellites from millions of miles away. A coronal mass ejection (CME) is a strange creature. It is not fire, nor radiation, but a cloud of charged particles hurled across the solar system like the breath of a star. Most pass harmlessly, but on rare occasions, one travels fast enough, aimed straight enough, and arrives at the exact moment Earth's magnetic shield is most vulnerable. Scientists call this convergence low probability, high consequence. Cayce had another name for it: a silence over the Earth. The last event of this nature happened in 1859, long before our world was woven from electronics and satellites. The Carrington event lit the skies with auroras bright enough to read newspapers by. Telegraph stations caught fire. Needles melted. And yet humanity survived it as a lead because humanity had almost nothing electrical to lose. Now imagine such an event in a world where everything depends on circuits, signals, and invisible threads of energy crossing the sky. ACME hitting an already wavering magnetosphere would not set telegraph paper ablaze. It would shut down the heartbeat of the digital world. Power grids would fail in cascades. Satellites would flicker, stall, and fall silent. GPS would vanish. Communication networks, those modern constellations of data, would blink out one by one until the world went dark, not with fire, but with stillness. Hours later, cities would lose their glow, streets would fold into shadow, machines would sleep. The constant background noise of refrigeration, traffic, air systems, and transmissions would fade into an absence so complete it would feel supernatural. Humanity has not known true silence for hundreds of years. Its return would feel like the end of something, but perhaps also like the beginning of something else. This is the scenario that now haunts the scientific world, not as prophecy, but as possibility. A possibility that grows sharper each time the sun unleashes another flare, and each time Earth's magnetic readings dip a fraction lower. Yet, to Cayce, the silence was never a punishment. It was a threshold. He said there would come a moment when humanity could no longer distract itself with noise. A moment when the external world pauses so the internal world can finally be heard. He described the silence not as terror, but as reflection. Man must listen before he may see. and perhaps that is the most haunting aspect, the idea that the earth would not strike at us, but strip away the illusions we built around ourselves. For the first 24 hours of such a blackout, fear would likely dominate, not because of danger, but because of unfamiliarity. The sky would glow in strange colors as charged particles collided with oxygen and nitrogen. Auroras might bleed across continents that had never known them. Some regions would see the stars vanish behind a veil of shimmering haze. In others, the atmosphere might hum faintly an electromagnetic whisper, drifting across mountain ridges and empty plains. People would reach for their phones and find them empty. They would flick light switches out of habit and be surprised by the nothingness. They would step outside and realize how loud the world had been and how heavy its silence now felt. By the second day, something deeper would begin. With no distractions, no digital noisy, no escape into screens, humanity would confront a truth Cayce hinted at repeatedly, that we have forgotten how to be alone with ourselves, forgotten how to hear our own inner compass beneath the static of endless information. Without electricity, the world would shrink and expand at the same time, shrinking to the space around one's physical presence, expanding to the unexplored territory of the mind. On the third day, many would experience something unexpected: clarity. Not mystical visions, but the sharpening of awareness that comes when the familiar scaffolding of life is removed. People would hear wind, water, breath, birds, trees. They would rediscover the oldest forms of orientation, the warmth of the sun, the angle of shadows, the rhythm of nature's pulse. Communities might gather quietly, share in firelight and warmth. Families might speak more deeply than they have in years. Strangers might help one another without hesitation. For in the absence of digital connection, human connection becomes necessary again. Cayce believed this was the dawn beneath the darkness. He never insisted on 3 literal days, nor on literal darkness. He spoke instead of a symbolic period when humanity would be forced into humility, when the Earth's energy would reset and ours would recalibrate. He said the silence would come as a teaching, not an ending. That after the stillness, humanity would awaken with new sight. That what emerges from such a pause would not be the world as it was, but the world as it must become. In this way, the silent 3 days are not a catastrophe at all. They are a mirror, a cleansing, a moment when the earth exhales and waits for us to listen. And in the winter of 2025, with the magnetosphere trembling, the sun sharpening its aim, and the world itself behaving as though standing on the edge of a held breath, the possibility, however, remote, felt closer than ever before. A silence not of death, but of preparation. A darkness not of ending, but of beginning. The stillness before the turning. Long before the world learned to measure tremors with machines, ancient cultures felt them with their bones. They understood without graphs, without satellites, that the earth does not stir without meaning. Edgar Cayce seemed to carry that ancestral instinct within him, for he spoke of a time when the crust of the world would behave not as bedrock but as skin, shifting, swelling, breaking open where pressure had been ignored too long. He called it the Great Breaking Up, and as the final winter of 2025 deepened, the earth began to follow the script with unsettling precision. It started in the Pacific, as if the ocean itself remembered his words. The ring of fire, 30,000 miles of volcanic arcs and subduction zones, grew restless. Not violently, not in dramatic explosions, but in scattered pulses that resembled a heartbeat trying to find a new rhythm. Thousands of microquakes whispered along the ocean floor. In Alaska's Aleutians, magma chambers expanded by imperceptible degrees. Near Tonga, sonar scans captured methane bubbles, rising in slow, deliberate streams, like the sea exhaling secrets it had kept for millennia. To geologists, these were anomalies worth studying. To those who followed Cayce, they felt like pages turning pages of a prophecy long dismissed. Now emerging from the deep, Cayce had said the western portion of America would be broken up. Not obliterated, not swallowed whole, but fractured, reshaped. And indeed, faint signals of such a shift began to surface. Subtle but persistent tremors in California that danced just below the threshold of public notice. Unusual pressure patterns beneath the Cascades. And in Utah, a fault line long considered stable stirred with newfound energy, confusing the algorithms that monitor seismic tension. Japan, too, responded to this unseen summons. Islands trembled. Coastal waters churned against tides that behaved as though pulled by a second moon. Mount Sakurajima erupted not explosively but continuously, sending up quiet plumes day after day, like a monk offering incense to the sky. Scientists warned that persistent eruption patterns often precede structural change beneath the crust. Cayce once said Japan would face the CS hunger, the greater portion must go into the waters. And though no such catastrophe was immediate, the nation felt as if it were standing on the edge of a breath too large to release. Across the world, in Italy, Campi Flegrei, ancient caldera sleeping beneath towns and vineyards began to rise again. A few centimeters only, but rise it did. Streets cracked delicately, like eggshells, houses tilted by a hair's breadth. Locals felt the soft rumble of a slumbering giant turning in its bed. Volcanologists called it bradyseism, a long, slow swelling. Cayce called it the inner fire, answering the imbalance of man. And beneath Yellowstone, the most watched piece of land on Earth, deep magma pulses flickered on seismic charts like a coded message. No eruption threatened, but the giant was awake, watchful, present. This was the Great Breaking Up, not as a single headline, but as a symphony of subtle movements, calling attention to a truth. Cayce had repeated, "The Earth changes are less about destruction than adjustment, less about punishment than correction." He said the crust would shift as consciousness shifts, that the physical world reflects the spiritual one, the outer tremors mirroring the inner fractures of humanity. And humanity, by 2025, was fracturing indeed. Wars brewed, nations polarized, communities turned inward, compassion thinned like worn cloth, greed sharpened, anxiety pulsed globally. Cayce warned that when the hearts of men grow cold, the fires of the earth rise not to punish, but to restore balance. A world of fracture within breeds fracture without. This is why he described the final winter as a test. Not a test of strength or survival skill, but a test of orientation, what he called the moral north. For as the magnetic north drifted across the Arctic at unprecedented speed, so too did humanity's inner compass drift. Truth bent, unity broke. Fear found fertile ground. And in this destabilization, the Earth responded the only way a living system can, by shifting toward equilibrium. Equilibrium always comes with a price. Across the Pacific trenches, something extraordinary occurred. A new dome of rising magma was discovered west of Hawaii. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it pushed upward, displacing water, hinting at a future where land might one day surface. Another formation rose, near Tonga, an ancient story, repeating itself. Islands born from fire, continents seeded from volcanic breath. Cayce said new lands would appear as the Earth realigned. He said these lands were not simply geographical, they were symbols of renewal. Every rising island was a message. Creation follows upheaval, but humans rarely listen to messages written in stone and magma. We read fear in the cracks, not possibility. This is why Cayce insisted the final winter was spiritual as much as geological. He described it as a time of pruning, an ancient metaphor for renewal. A tree pruned harshly does not die. It grows stronger, fuller, more aligned with purpose. So too, he said, would humanity, those who clung to material identity, to conquest, division, or greed, would find themselves struggling to withstand the transition. But those who lived with compassion, humility, and service would feel an invisible guidance, a pull toward places of safety, both physical and spiritual. And indeed, around the world, strange stories began to surface. Entire communities reporting the same dream of water rising. Indigenous elders in the Andes feeling an ancestral call to move higher into the mountains. Pacific Islanders dreaming of fire below the sea. Groups in remote regions feeling compelled to migrate without understanding why. Psychologists framed these as collective anxieties. Historians compared them to myths, but in the quiet corners of prophecy, these were signs that the soul remembers what the mind forgets. Animals felt it too. Whales beached themselves in record numbers, misled by shifting magnetic lines. Birds migrated in chaotic spirals, landing thousands of miles from their usual paths. Even insects, tiny, unknowable navigators, appeared in regions they had never visited before. When the Earth shifts its field, every creature that lives by it shifts as well, and humans live by it more deeply than we realize. Our heartbeat aligns with the Schumann resonance, the planet's own pulse. Our intuition sharpens or dulls depending on electromagnetic conditions. Cayce believed that during the Great Breaking Up, human intuition would awaken as the old world loosened its grip. People would feel their way through the shift, guided not by logic or technology, but by resonance. Resonance is the language of the soul. As the final winter progressed, that resonance grew louder, nightmares and visions increased. Old memories resurfaced. People cried without knowing why. Others felt sudden clarity, purpose, or a call to simplicity. Cayce said these sensations would mark the beginning of humanity's internal shift, the pruning of fear to make space for awakening, but not all would embrace it. Some would resist, clinging tightly to old patterns even as they crumble. This too is part of the test. When the earth trembles, what do you hold on to? Power, possessions, denial, or compassion, connection, and truth. The Great Breaking Up was never about continents. It was about consciousness. Earth changes are only the shadow. The real shift happens in the heart. And in the winter of 2025, the question hung over humanity like a blade of ice. When the crust breaks, will we open? The answer, Cayce said, determines who endures the turning, who withstands the silence, and who walks into the new world that rises after the storm. When Edgar Cayce spoke of endings, he never lingered there. He always carried his vision forward, past the rupture, past the trembling, past the winter that seemed to eclipse the world. To him, destruction was only the surface of a deeper truth, the truth that every collapse is a clearing, every silence a doorway, every darkness a gestation of light waiting to be born. And so, as the final winter of 2025 deepened, and the earth hummed with the weight of its own correction, the question that hung between prophecy and present was no longer what will fall, but what will rise. In the weeks after the great shaking of the Pacific trenches, researchers reported something remarkable. 2 new seafloor domes, one near Tonga and one west of Hawaii, had expanded faster than predicted. The sea, once impenetrable in its depth, showed signs of lifting as if something beneath it were remembering how to breathe. Volcanic newborns, though still submerged, suggested the slow birth of new land. Scientists spoke cautiously of future islands. Cayce, if he were alive, might have said the Earth was preparing new places for new beginnings. But the new land he spoke of was never just physical. It was symbolic, an outward sign of an inward transformation. He believed that after the cleansing, humanity would not return to the old world. It would create a different one, shaped not by fear or conquest, but by remembrance. Remembrance of what it means to live in resonance with the earth, not in opposition to it. Remembrance of what it means to see the divine in one another. Cayce called these survivors children of light, not a chosen people, not a select group, but any soul that aligned itself with compassion, humility, and truth. He said these individuals would carry forward the seeds of a new civilization, one built on cooperation rather than conflict, connection rather than control. And in 2025, as the world strained beneath the weight of its imbalance, this idea felt less like mysticism and more like necessity. The turning point was not a single event. It was a shift in consciousness, subtle but unmistakable. People began to feel the fragility of the systems they relied on. They saw how easily digital noise could vanish, how quickly illusions dissolved when power grids flickered or satellites trembled under solar wind. And in that vulnerability, something ancient stirred, the awareness that humanity had drifted far from the heartbeat of the earth. When the skies glowed with crimson auroras dancing over unlikely latitudes, many felt awe mixed with unease. But some felt something else entirely, connection. The lights did not frighten them. They reminded them of childhood wonder, of timelessness, of a world larger and more mysterious than the narrow corridors of screens and schedules. In that moment, many realized what Cayce meant when he said the earth would signal the soul not through words, but through beauty woven into upheaval. And slowly, people began to turn inward, not in retreat, but in reflection. Across different cultures, a quiet shift began. Families gathered in candlelight, speaking more deeply than they had in years. Communities came together to share resources, not because of catastrophe, but because it felt right. Governments reevaluated energy grids, questioning the wisdom of dependency on fragile systems. Local food networks strengthened people, planted gardens, listened to the land, paused their frantic pursuit of endless growth. Even in cities, there were reports of moments fleeting but real when strangers helped each other without hesitation, as if something in the human spirit had been nudged awake. Cayce predicted this. He said the earth changes would force humanity to remember oneness, that in the silence, people would rediscover the divine spark within themselves and in each other. He described a future where technology would not vanish but evolve, powered by principles aligned with natural forces. Magnetism, vibration, resonance. He foresaw water not just as a resource but as an energy source. Light not only as illumination, but as healing. Thought not merely as mind, but as creation. These visions once sounded like metaphors, but in the wake of a shifting magnetosphere, rising heat from the ocean floor, and skies painted by the sun's charged breath, they became blueprints sketched softly across the horizon of possibility. Yet the transformation Cayce described was not automatic. It required choice. He warned that the final winter was a test not of survival, but of direction. The drift of the Earth's magnetic pole mirrored the drift of humanity's moral compass. And just as the planet sought a new equilibrium, so too must the human heart. Those who clung to the old frequency, fear, greed, division would find the new world unbearably heavy. Those who embraced compassion, integrity, and connection would rise with it. Because every turning of the earth is matched by a turning of the soul. And so humanity stood at a crossroads in 2025, not between life and death, but between blindness and awakening. The winter pressed inward like an ancient hand, guiding humanity toward humility. Animals moved strangely. Dreams deepened, intuition sharpened. It was as if the veil between the outer world and the inner world had thinned, revealing a truth we always knew but had forgotten. The truth that we are not separate from the earth, we are expressions of it. In this understanding lies the new north, a true axis shift. Cayce foresaw, not the tilt of continents or poles, but the tilt of the human heart back toward compassion as its guiding star. This was the real pole shift. The physical world was only its shadow, and as the final winter reached its quiet peak, people felt a subtle change, a softness in the air, a calm beneath the chaos, a sense that after all the trembling, something steady was emerging beneath their feet. It was not the end, it was alignment. The earth was not dying, it was righting itself. And so humanity, shaken awake by storms, light, and silence, began to right itself too. Now imagine the world in the weeks after the great stillness. Not a world broken, but a world hushed, softened, as though the earth were exhaling a long-held breath. Snow falls lightly on quiet roofs. Rivers move with slower confidence. The sky, once painted with violent storms, now carries a gentler shade of dawn. People wake with a calm they cannot name, feeling the faint pulse of something ancient and kind beneath their feet. They walk outside and notice things they once overlooked: the shape of trees silhouetted against early light, the rhythm of their own breath joining the morning air, the way silence feels less like emptiness and more like presence. Conversations become slower, movements become intentional. For the first time in many years, humanity is not running ahead of itself. It is simply being. This is the world Cayce glimpsed, a world not purified by fire, but by remembrance. A world where people look at one another and see not competition, not division, but kinship. Where the earth is not seen as resource, but as companion. Where progress is measured not by speed, but by harmony. And in this renewed quiet, something glows. A seed planted long ago in the soul of humanity begins to rise toward the light. The final winter is passing. Its frost did not kill it clarified. Its darkness did not end it prepared. And now, on the horizon, the first pale shimmer of a golden dawn stretches across the sky. The turning is complete. The heart has found its north again. And with that, the earth alive awake. Renewed whispers its final reminder. Every dawn begins in darkness. Every awakening begins in silence. And every new world begins in the heart.